Hi, welcome to Parenting the Adlerian Way. I'm your host, Adlerian family counselor and parenting expert Alyson Schafer. Each week, I answer your burning parenting questions to help reduce the stress of parenting one tip at a time. We'll explore Adlerian psychology together and learn methods of child guidance for raising a happy, confident, capable, resilient child. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I have a great interview ahead for you. I'm going to be chatting with Dr. Katie Hurley. Let me just say a little bit about her. So Dr. Hurley has a doctorate in social work. She's a licensed clinical social worker, and she's the vice president of community initiatives for the JED Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to teen and young adult mental health and suicide prevention. She is the author of 5 books at the intersection of youth, parenting, and mental health, including the award-winning No More Mean Girls and her new release, which we're going to talk about today, Breaking the Boy Code. Dr. Hurley is dedicated to promoting the mental health of tweens, teens, and young adults in her private practice, and she speaks for schools, nonprofits, and other organizations and podcasts like mine. Thanks for being on. Good to see you again.
Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, and congratulations on birthing another book. I know how hard it is to get one of those babies out into the world, so
it's
congrats.
getting harder and harder. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness. And, you know, I'm actually going to be a grandmother in August, and thank you. I'm very excited, and they've decided to know the gender before birth, and I'm actually going to be the grandmother of my first grandchild, who is a boy. So this is very topical for me. I raised 2 daughters, and now I got to get my head around boys, and the world has changed a little bit. So
baby boys are so fun, though, just FYI.
I'm very excited. I'm very excited. So thank you for letting me get ahead of reading the book so that I'd be prepared to speak to you about this. Would it be fair if I just sort of say that, like, the kind of core concept that you're covering off in this book is that the idea that our boys today, and I say this again thinking about my grandson, that they've got a unique struggle today, and not so much that they are less capable, but really that there's this constraint, this new constraint that we call the boy code, and that is really what they are kind of up against, and that the culprit there is socialization more than genetics or, XY chromosomes or whatever. Is that fair to say as the big umbrella piece?
That's fair to say. I always say the boy code has been around. It's not that it's necessarily new. And when we talk about the nuance underneath those words, you'll hear things that are familiar from previous generations.
Yeah.
The difference is that the world has changed, but we have not allowed boys to change with it. So they continue to grow up with the similar socialization as they did 40, 50 years ago, which doesn't really work in today's environment. And so we kind of set them up to fail in a way.
So, and this, say what the boy code is, because I don't want to make assumptions. Is the boy code to be differentiated from the other? Like, I hear manosphere, I hear toxic masculinity. Are those all interchangeable? Like, it's clearly these buzzy words are floating around. So we are talking about this phenomena.
Right. So the manosphere is like the great big wide world of the internet where some of this hypermasculinity lives. I prefer to use hypermasculinity over toxic masculinity because I really don't want boys to grow up thinking that toxic is what they're supposed to be. What a terrible thing to think about, just like when I wrote about mean girls and I'm like, stop putting mean next to girls. I mean, we don't want that. We're creating systems that are not fair. But so the manosphere kind of refers to the set of, channels and groups and all the stuff that live online that talk about this hyper masculinity content. The boy code kind of stems from what we call the man box. And that is, there was a study done by Ecumundo many years ago about how men think of themselves in terms of how they're supposed to operate in the world. Now, for that particular, and there have been other man box studies too. For that particular study, they studied young men from the United States, Mexico, and the United Kingdom. And what they discovered was that there was a lot of feelings around men are supposed to be stoic, hide their emotions as much as possible. Men should solve problems with aggression. physical or verbal. Men are expected to be providers. They're expected to be in control of finances. And, they're really expected to, lead relationships. And so there's like these, all of that, you having been in the field a long time will say that's not really new, right? Where it trickles down to the boy code for high school and, young boys and high school boys and even young adult males is sort of this like, don't cry, like you never get caught crying in front of other boys. That is a big no-no. If boys are, ribbing you in some way or whatever the word they're using now, like you are supposed to just take it. You just take it. If you have a snappy comeback, fine. But otherwise you take it. You don't show emotion. You don't tell, snitches get stitches is still very much a thing. So you never tell, no matter how bad the harassment is, whether it's, hate-based harassment and bullying, never tell. Always protect other boys. Locker room talk's very normalized, how they talk about females. And the other part of the man box, which has trickled down to the boy code, is this idea of hypersexuality, having sex with as many partners as you can.
Your body count.
Yep, the body count, but also combined with homophobia. So you better be heterosexual. So it's a lot.
It's so amazing that the discrepancy between all the work that we've done to try to make headway into social equality and pay equity, and all changing these social norms, and yet it seems that, and again, it could just be my lens on it, but it feels like this is just particularly flared up. You're right. We had the Marlboro Man, and this kind of does go back into the ages. I agree. But there does seem to be this flare up now. And is that, truly happening, or is it just that my eyes are on this right now? I mean, the Andrew Tates, what we're seeing, there's so many clippable quotes that you could grab that are out in media now. So is it being overreported, or is there really an increase in this phenomena right now?
No, there's an increase. And so, there's a lot of layers to it. The manosphere has been tracked since, 2010 or early 2000s. But what's different is young influencers who are being influenced by the Andrew Tates and Clavicular and the guys at the top. So younger TikTok influencers who are taking that messaging and bringing it down to even younger boys. And it's unfair to say TikTok because it's everywhere. It's like across all social media platforms, gaming, chats. It's literally everywhere. If it's online, if you're online in some way, it's there and findable. And so it's in their faces all the time. And, I say to parents all the time that often when boys start to see this content, it's not that they're actually searching for it. They're not like, what's the manosphere? They're searching for fairly benign self-help things like, what's the best shampoo for curly hair? Or like, what's the best kind of deodorant to stop me from sweating all day long? Or things like that, hygiene things. They'll search for like social skills tips. How do I talk to a girl? How do I join a group that I don't know? So they'll ask very benign questions, and then they start seeing these videos. These influencers have a very particular playbook. So they build trust. They come through the screen as like, I get it. You're lonely. I used to be lonely. Here's the 5 things I did to not be lonely anymore. They're going to center around looks maxing, making yourself look better so that you look more attractive to people. They think that attractive people have more friends and more dates, period. And some of that looks maxing content is benign, like shower every day. That's just good advice. And parents are like, yeah, great, And so
someone got my teenage boy to shower. Yay.
Yeah.
Don't cut that down, Katie.
Right. And some of it's like harmful, like, you should be hammering literally your jawline to get a more, straight jawline and all that stuff. So it runs the gamut. And then they also go into like, you have to get rich quick. Now, when you're thinking about a 14-year-old boy watching this content on whatever platform, why do they have to get rich quick? They're 14 years old. Like maybe get a paper route. It's not going to get you rich quick, but you'll learn to work. But they draw them into this world of sports betting, gambling by way of day trading. And the kids don't know enough to know that they're giving them these coupon codes and they're selling them these course packs and how to get rich quick. Like they're just making money off them. And they don't have the critical thinking skills yet to say, like, this guy's just making money off me and my life has not changed at all after following his 5 tips and, whatever it is. So they're teaching boys to climb on top of each other, to be very much in control of women. It all comes down to control, control, control. And then that connects to what we call red pill content. So this is content creators like Andrew Tate, although he would be even more extreme, but, that guy Clavicular has been in the news constantly lately. Like he's red pill content. So
this is further down. This is further down the grooming funnel of how we move our young boys in this direction. Okay.
Yeah. And so this kind of content is centered around same. It's very misogynistic, but like a level up. So it's like, oh, women hate us. Yeah, you're not going to get a good job because girls get them now. And it's women have ruined everything. It's very like anti-feminist, anti-female. And so women are treated as bodies. Now it's really all about like, they'll talk about all their sexual encounters, but it's like they throw these girls away. They use them, throw them away. They almost make fun of them on videos sometimes. It's really, really disturbing. And then that feeds into black pill content, which is very extreme ideology. It's very extreme right-wing, white nationalist, dangerous ideology.
Is that, and the incels?
They live in the red pill. Yeah.
Oh, it's hard to believe it gets worse than that, but okay. So yeah. That's,
yep.
Wow. Now I have to believe in that funnel, in that grooming process, there was still the entry point, because I was sort of surprised that, we're talking about our teen boys, but even before adolescence, there had to be someone, I agree. If you're looking for shampoo or how to shower or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean you had low self-esteem. But the boy code, you've been living the boy code before you hit 14.
Absolutely.
Which is probably why you weren't looking for solutions from your parents when you were, I'm not allowed to ask for help around my hair. I better Google it online, because if I really want to be a man, I should already know everything, right? So I think they're already the product of a childhood that's got them in a position to go into that funnel, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they do, a study on parenting boys, showed that even moms were more biased against boys in a way of like, where if they had a girl and a boy, they would tell the boy to like basically suck it up, tough it out, starting at age 5, where girls were more like, it's okay, empathy. Like we'll use empathy with the girls. They need us to help, calm them through something hard. Boys, stop crying. Go, like tough it up, figure it out, solve your problem. And that's still very much prevalent in a lot of households, and that's generational. And even sometimes parents will say to me, I knew it, I felt the words come out of my mouth and I had said it and it was too late and they came out. And it's like, yeah, because that's how you grew up, so if that's what you've heard and that's what you hear around you, it makes sense. It's going to come out of your mouth. So it's a learning process for parents, for grandparents.
I seem to remember, and I'm terrible at giving good citations. My brain doesn't have that functionality, apparently. But it was research that was looking at the behavior of boys in kindergarten classrooms. And they were saying as early as kindergarten, if one of the boys went to start to play in the kitchen area, it was the other boys that would say, that's for girls. And would move them away. So already at kindergarten, they had a sense of what was girl play, what was boy play, and that it's lesser. And I think that's an important theme. Yeah. This idea that, and if it's girl stuff, not only is it different than boy stuff, but it's less than, right? That's a big Adlerian tenet that he talks about masculine protest. This is, way back at the beginning of developing his theory, and he's talking about that human need for all of us to overcome, like to move from an inferior position to a superior position. In turn of the century, men held all the power and, could own land, it could vote, and women didn't. And anything that was female, in fact, if you think about it, if females move into an occupational area, the base salary starts to drop because women have come in and started polluting or whatever. So,
yep.
And so it's even as young as kindergarten, boys know that not only is that a female thing, that's a lesser thing. Like,
Yeah.
icky, don't have female qual. I think that's why that insult, throw like a girl. It's like, that's what an insult. It's not that you're different gender. It's that girls are less than.
Right. And, there's been so much work in empowering girls, right? And so like Throw Like a Girl got, made into advertisements as like, yeah, this is good. And, with female athletes and all that. And so we've done a lot of work for girls. There's still a lot more that needs to be done. I will always say that. But we've done a lot of work to help empower girls. And like, so it's not, if a girl goes and plays with construction toys, let's say, other girls aren't going to pull her away and say, that's for boys. They're going to be like, yeah, let's do this, right? Because girls are now, like, we have tried so hard to just take gender out of play. It just makes good sense across the board. You don't need to gender play, right? You're up against, of course, department stores that sell girl toys, boy toys, and, girl clothes, boy clothes. Everything's so separate still. But we've worked hard to kind of change that for young girls. But for boys, not so much. So still, when they make those decisions, like, no, I actually want to play chef. It's like, no, so it's hard.
That's, even just that example, right? Where, to your point, you just walk into a toy store without any labeling, you would know which aisle was what. So if we got smart enough to start making trucks that are construction trucks that are pink, if you took a magic wand, from a fairy kit and made it blue, a boy would still not be allowed to prance around with a blue fairy wand. That would still be very much like commented on by other boys, but also some parents still find that threatening when, I hear it a lot with just like wanting to, like, oh, mommy's putting on nail polish. I want to put on nail polish too. Oh no, nail polish is for girls. That's not a boy thing. I like sometimes these things are subtle when you think, oh, I didn't do that as a parent. It's like, well, I don't know if we really played back. I'm sure all of us had a little oopsie doodle that's out of our awareness,
Yeah.
And so what's the cost? Like, how are our boys suffering that they're constrained in this? We've said can't show their emotions, but there's some other things that are constraining around this boy code that must pay a cost to them.
Well, friendship is hard in boy world. It's really, really hard. And part of that is the way that they treat each other because of this sort of push toward like, verbal aggression and like climb to the top. And, he who has the funniest lines is the, top of the social hierarchy. I mean, people forget that boys have social hierarchies just as much as girls do, just as much. And it's difficult, and maybe you get up there because you're like really good at this certain video game. Maybe you get up there because you're an athlete or, there are certain things like male athletes are always looked up to. Go to any school campus and you're going to see male athletes put on a pedestal by their peers, by their schools.
Good point. In terms of it being systemic, this messaging being systemic.
Yeah.
And I know the locker room, that just reminds me of like a recent event we had here in Ontario where there was actual sexual assault, boy on boy sexual assault that was in their world just like hazing. To them, this, you know what I mean? Again, it was sort of like proving your masculinity by taking it, by tolerating it, and the whole like, and nobody reporting, and it had been going on. It just finally crossed a line that things blew up for all these boys. But I imagine if that happened there and that got reported on, what's happening that's just not subclinical, but I'm sure that there are common incidences like this where the hazing is degrading and embarrassing, and there's a humiliation aspect to it.
Yeah, hazing is a whole issue, and it's not just everyone wants to look at the college fraternities, but is it in high school and middle school? It is in all kinds of places, and it is very much based in shame and humiliation. So part of it is you cut them down, right, to make them like, you got to take all their self-worth away from them because then they'll follow. This is how leaders create followers in that world. And my family makes fun of me because I watch a lot of documentaries about religious cults, but it's the same process. And that's kind of why I watch it. The psychology fascinates me. It's take everything away, your self-worth, like who you thought you were, break them down, and then they'll rise up as followers who listen to everything you say. And that happens in boy world all the time. And so that's what's happening. Like, I keep saying the red pillars, like this is a cult. It's online. They don't have a ranch that they go to. It is online, but this is a cult. These are men who are training other men to be so fearful of women that they will be aggressive toward them. I mean, and so boys are not only struggling with their friendships, because who do you trust and who's actually your friend? But they're also struggling with, same sex and opposite sex relationships, where it basically rape culture is just, it's like rape lessons. It's teaching boys to use aggressive sexual tactics to get their needs met.
And to ignore consent.
Yes.
Wow. It sort of leads the question, if it's so in the culture, what are we supposed to do about this? I mean, as a parent listening, first of all, I mean, I think this is something that has less awareness than some other problems. Like, I mean, it's growing in awareness, but I don't think that there has been as much covered on this topic on Netflix as there has been on religious cults, where you actually get footage inside the ranches to, you know what I mean? Like, we're not talking enough about this. It is not enough in the public eye. And when you compare how many hours our youth are spending online or spending in groups with other kids, just in terms of, being in the classroom, how many hours are living in social worlds with other boys, we have to increase the awareness. Your book does a great job of that. But there's got to be more awareness we bring to this, let alone some of the action items. How else can we bring more awareness as a first step to this?
So, and I know you're up in Canada and I'm in the United States, and, I keep telling people, call your representatives. So whatever that, equivalent is where you are, call your representatives and say, hey, this is a problem. And don't think for 1 second that it's not in your community, because it is. It's in classrooms. It's showing up in classrooms. Teachers are like, what do I do about this? This is not their job. They're not trained for this. Really, nobody is, to be honest. Netflix did the show Adolescence.
Millions of views.
Yeah, millions of views. But it was also the extreme. And Louis Theroux's new doc, Inside the Manosphere, also well done, but also very extreme. So talking to the ones making so much money at the top of the food chain in the manosphere. What we need, documentarians take note, what we need is a look at just socialization of boys and how they get from that kindergartner who wanted to play house to a red pillar by age 15. How can we raise more awareness about that period, the sort of slow entry points? Why are boys so lonely right now? Because they don't know how to form relationships. They're struggling to form trusting relationships that are based on fun also, they're playing more games. They're on their phones. They're playing less like, hey, go outside and shoot hoops and just be friends together outside doing things. That's happening less. And they're more, jumping into these virtual worlds. I'm not against social media at all, but I am against the shortening of boyhood. And we have done that. We're forcing them to grow up really quickly. I mean, there's so many layers, like I said, but it's like, so, and then parents are, here in America, childhood sports have become a $40 billion industry. Oh. So
well, listen, we're not that far behind. I mean, we tend to follow in the patterns of the US, just, maybe we don't have the same dollar amounts and maybe we don't have the same population amounts. But those trends come through Canada right on the heels of. So you guys are always sort of our cautionary tale.
Right. And, so we took a thing that used to be so fun. Like, I grew up in the 70s and 80s and it's like youth sports were fun. Half the people had no skills. There's always the one kid that you're like, oh, he's going to go pro. And then everybody else was very woefully average in a great way. And it was fun, right? And the teams were balanced and it was good. And now like kids are being thrown into club sports at like age 5, which is absurd just purely from a physical and emotional developmental perspective alone. But they're being pushed and parents are buying into this narrative that doing this will help them get to play in college and potentially professionally. And they know the statistics. They're so slim. The margins are so slim. And yet we've all followed along and taken this fun, healthy outlet for children and made it into this thing that's so high pressure. So kids drop out and then they're like, oh, why are they dropping out? Well, because it's not fun. Kids are supposed to have fun.
I know we've really gotten very misguided about a whole bunch of values.
Yeah.
So to your point, there's a lot of factors that are making this a complex issue. But we're here now, and we've besides those documentarians who need to get out there and just talk about the average experience of the average kid and how this insidious, the insidious nature coming from all sides is really making boyhood and now developing into manhood something that becomes pathologic. I'm sure the mental health associations with this must be huge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, depression, anxiety, substance misuse at a very early age and ongoing. I mean, the list goes on. But yeah, this is the mental health effects of this, falling into this stoicism and, hypermasculinity and all of this stuff. It's not working. I mean, one of the influencers even, what they don't tell the youngsters in the videos, they sometimes admit in media spots, and one even admitted that, like, though he sells creatine and all this stuff to young people, he uses meth to stay thin and it's killing him. And he knows he's using too much. And, these people need help.
Yeah.
People need help. Yeah. But I do, getting back to your question of what can we do, I think just really talking to other parents, talking to other people like, hey, I heard about this. What do you know about this? Can we learn more? Like maybe we should think about it from our, I would love with Jed, I work with cities and municipalities sometimes on suicide prevention. And this does pose an increased suicide risk. And boys are 3.5 more times likely to die by suicide than girls right now. And so I would love it if city councils, town councils, city councils, whatever you call it, wherever you live, would get involved and learn about it and then put together youth task force and start putting together things that youth will actually use. Young people need third spaces. That's what we refer to as, sometimes towns have like a teen center. What we find by and large is that the youngest are using the teen centers. So like more like tweens, 10 to 12-year-olds, yes. We use the teen centers. Teenagers need places to go. They don't want youngish feeling places, but they need places to go. There are some cities where they build like teen parks with like cool things that teens might actually like, swings that are for adults, stuff like that they might actually use. And it works. We have so few third spaces out there that actually function in a way that teens would use them. And part of that is we don't listen to them.
I was just about to say, and, no surprise there. Probably nobody was consulting them on what would be attractive and what.
Yep.
And if you get it wrong with teens, they're so sensitive to, it not being handled properly. It looks too babyish, looks too parent, looks too whatever. They got to be stakeholders in what's out there. They got a lot of opinions. That's a great way to engage them. If you're a parent of a boy right now, and you're one of the common things that I get is like, well, they won't talk to me about their feelings. They won't talk to me about their problems. And there are some truths to the fact that the language center in a male brain is different than a female brain, mm-hmm. but that's very different than the socializing to don't talk about your feelings and don't ask for help, right? So what's a parent to do if it's already come to that, which happens again pretty young? How do you reach them to have a conversation about the impact of some of these exposures?
Yeah, well, part of this is that because so many boys grow up not talking about feelings, then they get to be teens and parents are like, oh, wait, I need to do this. And then they're like, how are you feeling? And they're like, go away. Right. So it's like,
too much,
they're
too
not
late.
used to it. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that they can't learn. And so part of it is just like, use their language. It's so funny. Like online people are always like trying to decode Gen Z and Gen Alpha and like, their language is ridiculous. But if you go back in time, like I'm Gen X, we had ridiculous language too. We all young people have been making up their own words since forever. So meet them where they are, learn to talk about what they like to talk about. We tend to do this thing where we hear about something and then we're like, okay, I'm going to only talk about this thing because I got to get to the bottom of this and make sure it's not like infiltrating my son's brain. But instead of that, like try and engage in more conversations about what your kid already likes to talk about and do it in an informal way. So we know that research consistently shows that people in general are more likely to talk when they're side by side doing an activity than just sitting facing each other. And, I always joke, but like somehow 10, 15 years ago, somebody told the whole world that the best time to talk to your kid is when they're in the back of your car. And young people consistently tell me they hate this. Tell my parents to stop doing this. I just want to chill out and listen to music. Fair, right? So, like play ping pong, play a board game, go for a hike, walk the dog, like go for ice cream, like do something. And then just engage them in regular old conversation. Hey, what was funny at school this week? Anything interesting happening? What's your favorite class? The usuals. And then you can sort of start to talk about like, oh, I saw this thing. Like, do you know about this guy? I mean, I did say to my son, like, do you know who clavicular is? And he said this was a few months ago. And he was like, no, but I think I'm not going to want to know. And so we, looking it up together. He's like, Mom, don't get obsessed with this. And I'm like, I am obsessed with it. But he, so like, then that's when you kind of step into it and say like, oh, I heard about this thing. I saw this thing on TV or I saw it online or whatever. And like, what do you make of this? Like, do you actually hear about this? And boys will say like, they're not going to give you all the same details. It's like, I can text my husband a really long paragraph and the response is going to be cool. Thanks. It's different communication patterns. So don't expect them to spill their guts and talk your ear off like your daughter does at 11 o'clock at night, because they don't do that as much. Like sometimes they don't need to, it's a different process, but, do ask questions and do take an interest in their interests. So, like I talk a lot of poli-sci with my 17-year-old son because that's what he's interested in right now. Like that is his thing. So we talk about that. We talk about the Boston Celtics. Like we start conversations talking about things that he really values and is interested in. And then we move into some of the other stuff.
Yeah, that's just one area of conversation, not like we need to sit down and have like a parenting talk about this new world threat or whatever.
Exactly.
Even just the way that you frame that, I think is so smart too. Like it's a little bit, it's encouraging and has a positive attitude about the child when you say things like, hey, like, what have you heard about the so-and-so? It's like you are the anthropologist with ears and eyes on the ground. Educate me about what you're learning about these people or whatever, as opposed to, I'm the sage on the stage. I have more years of wisdom and I'm suddenly going to be, the most knowledgeable person about online experiences in like, okay, right. Even as I'm saying it, I'm like, I've already knocked down all my credentials,
right.
You're too old. You're a female. Who's listening to you? I mean, luckily in my profession, I used to be able to say to my daughters anyways, it's kind of like, I'm putting together a parenting workshop and can you help bring me up to speed on X, Y, and Z? So I loved being able to tap into them, being able to say, no, you educate me. But it's really very much the same thing. We say, have you heard? Or, what are other kids doing? Like you're my conduit towards all this knowledge. And I think they appreciate that.
They do.
Being respected for being in the know for something that we're not in the know about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. We don't have to be the experts all the time. We can center them and their needs and learn from that what they actually do need. I was going to say, I do always say to parents, because parents are asking a lot about this now because media is picking up on it, at a higher level, parents are starting to ask a lot about it. And I think the thing we have to remember is like, if you are not ready to talk to your sons about porn or gambling or, looks maxing and red pill content, if you don't have that knowledge base and you don't feel ready to talk to them about it, then they shouldn't be in these spaces because they are going to encounter it. And so, I mean, essentially you have to get yourself ready, and it's hard.
Yeah, whether you like it or not. So let's say you're there, you've got the teenage son who is talking disrespectfully to you as mom or saying derogatory comments about women in general, is really doing a lot of that posturing. You know that they're ingesting this content, and you do feel like you have lost your son and that they have joined this cult. At that point, how does one try to, run interference on it, because I think that once they've kind of got their hooks in brainwashing and convincing, where is a parent to go? Is that the course where you go for therapy? I don't know if you'd get them in a seat because they probably don't think there's anything wrong with them. They're probably,
Right.
how do you intervene when the problem's already at that level?
So I am a fan of calling in versus calling out. So when we call out kids for behavior, we're like, don't do that. Don't say that thing. Like, that hurts people. We kind of bark at them. When we call in, we make space to sit down and discuss. And so if I were hearing a lot of that kind of language, I would sit down with my son and say, hey, I'm noticing you said some things like this, this, and this. Like, what does that mean to you? Can you tell me more about that? Because as a woman, some of that actually hurts my feelings. And I don't want you to talk that way in the house, but I also want to understand why you're talking that way and what that actually means inside of your mind. And so I would call in, and it's almost like having a conference, right? Where you sit and you talk about what does this mean for you, so that I can understand where it's coming from. And then we can figure out together what's a better way to say what you're trying to say. So, I mean, it's hard because the knee-jerk reaction is always going to be nip it, right? No, don't say those things. And you absolutely need to set hard limits on this kind of language in your home. If it's acceptable at home, it is acceptable everywhere else in the mind of a young person. So don't let it be acceptable in your home, but that doesn't have to lead to a fight every time. That can lead to discussions about, where does it come from? What does it mean? And what are you actually trying to say? And then underneath that, what's the feeling, right? Sometimes you can get to the feeling without asking, what are you feeling? But by modeling, I heard you say something, and it left me feeling upset and just stressed a little bit. By modeling that for them, you humanize what has been dehumanized online. So all of this is deprogramming empathy and compassion, all this stuff they're ingesting. You bring it back by being able to say, this hurts. And I'm worried about, I'm an adult and I know how to handle hurt, but I'm worried about how a girl your age would feel if you spoke this way in front of her. So let's talk about that. A lot of times, I mean, anecdotally, a lot of young boys, college age boys who've dipped into this world then come out, say that actually what brings them out is other boys who saying
what's happened to you.
Yep.
Okay.
And so one thing I, talk about a lot in the book is raise your boys to be the one who says, oh, that's not cool. Why are you saying that? Why are you saying that is a showstopper for boys. That, you can be that's not cool, or you can say things like that to other boys, but they're gonna, if they think they're in the power position, they're likely to keep going. But when you're bro, why are you saying that? That's when they'll go silent and think for a second. And so teaching boys to stand up in this non-aggressive, but very pointed, very direct way is what will help yank other boys out of the ideology. But parents should absolutely address it too.
Yeah. But so that's so interesting, because that does really map well onto the idea of the bully and the victim and the bystander model, where they're saying that the bystanders have so much power in changing that dynamic. And of course, if their whole goal is to get status, and then the status is it's not working, you're actually, that's repugnant as opposed to that's impressing me. Then they're moving against what their end goal is, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But then
absolutely.
you got to your point that it does mean that raising those other boys to speak up, and if it's a concern that boys are having trouble with relationships and they don't want to jeopardize their social standing. It does take a lot of courage to stand up then, right? It does take a lot of courage.
It does. It takes courage to say something back. But, when they've had enough, they'll do it. When they've had enough of it and they're sick of it, they'll do it. I mean, people always try to teach kids to walk away from a bully, and that's also exceptionally hard to do. But, empowering boys, like, you have a voice too. Like, if you hear something that's like, ick, and talking to them too about, like, who's a female in your life that you really respect, you really care about? Like, do you have a sibling? Do you have a cousin, your mom, whatever? Think about them, like insert them, imagine them in this situation, and then decide how you would respond. So sometimes when we can operationalize it a little bit more and think about like how this would actually affect someone I love, it's easier to stand up and say like, oh, this is gross.
Yeah, that's that humanizing piece. Is there a different role for dads in this formula? I mean, I know not that all families have a present dad, but in a family where there is a father figure, is there a unique role that they play in this?
Absolutely, and that is really learning to practice vulnerability in the family.
Well, what would that look like? What
you can be a provider, and you can like love all of those values that you've worked hard for, right? But you can be that, and you can say like, I'm feeling sad about something. I'm feeling stressed about something. I'm feeling isolated. I haven't had time with my friends in a while. So like learning to talk about your mental health and even just day-to-day feelings. Dads can learn how to do that. And when they do, it normalizes for boys. Men have emotions too. They absolutely do. And they will for their entire lives. Whether or not you ever get diagnosed with anxiety or depression, you will have lots of emotions. And so just normalizing talking about it, and like, what do you do to cope besides crack a beer, right? Like, what do you actually do?
Yeah.
Do you go for a walk? Do you, watch TV? Do you turn on a game? Do you what do you do? And I'm begging dads right now to have that coping thing not be jumping into your phone, right?
Right. Yes.
Be something other than that, just to show that there are ways to cope with how you're feeling without jumping into technology.
So that modeling piece. Can a dad pull their son out as effectively as a peer?
Peers honestly are really powerful.
Yeah.
Peers are powerful, but I think dads should try.
Yeah.
Part of what happens sometimes with dads is like men are socialized to be protectors, and so they move into protect mom mode, or if there are female siblings in the house, they move into so they get mad. They're trying to protect the females in the house, and they get mad at the son. If they can do it in a way where they're like, ooh, what do people say when you say that? Like, what do you say that in front of your friends? How do they react? Like, so that they can kind of like jog them out of what they're of that like very, limited stance for a second.
Well, I would say, that makes me think that if you get too aggressive in your rebuttal, then you're actually kind of modeling.
You're feeding it.
Right. Exactly. Oh my goodness. So, do you have any other big takeaways that you really want to make sure that parents have? I mean, obviously, I'd like them to read all the content in the book. You can't cover everything in a short podcast, and there's so much more that's in there. But to be fair, to make sure that the main points that you want to make sure our listeners got from our chat today, I want to make sure that you've got the floor.
Yeah, no, I really think, the big things are really helping boys learn how to make friends that are like good fit friends for them. So like maybe you're on a team of some sort, or you're in a band, or you're whatever. Those people might be your good friends, but they might not. Like you might need to search around and try other things to find like the best fit friendships for you. And that's okay. It's okay to float. You don't have to be stuck in a group. So really talking about social skills and how you enter groups and how do you start a new friendship? Kids are so used to starting things on Snapchat now that they're forgetting how to do it in person. So that's just like, and that's when they're evaluating like what boys are searching for on AI right now, a lot of it is social skills. Like, how do I get a new friend? How do I get a new friend group? Stuff like that. So really like just opening those conversations and talking about your own life, like how friendships sometimes have seasons, and that's okay. And this was a good friend at this point in my life, but now this person's probably closer. Really normalizing just talking about that stuff. But also like really helping boys think about how they cope with emotions, because they do have them. Every day they have them. So what can they do besides being stoic and stuffing it in? What are things that work for them? And this is where we have to really get granular in terms of asking them to speak up. Like, have you ever tried deep breathing? Do you feel like it's effective? Do you feel like that's not something you really want to try? Like, okay, then let's think about something else. Like if you're feeling stressed out before a test, do you want to try chewing peppermint gum? Because that might help. Do you want to try ice cold water? Because that might help your nervous system. So really talking them through all kinds of different ways to cope with different emotions and just normalize talking about that and then model it yourself, in the moment.
That all seems like something that I think parents probably feel like, okay, sign me up for that, because I really don't know if I can talk about I don't know. I don't know if I can talk about the red pill yet. I'll start here.
Yep.
But it is, but sometimes the biggest solutions are sometimes the simplest, and we just forget, like, boy, guess what? It's a protective factor to have good relationships with your sons. And it's a protective factor for them to have good relationship with their friend groups. And sometimes those sort of basics, life gets busy because we're worried about their standing on their little league, baseball team, and getting distracted with learning 3 languages and, their report card. And we forget that some of the parenting pieces that really need our time and attention are some of those basic fundamental building blocks.
Yep. Connection.
Unbelievable. Well, thank you so much. People are going to probably want to find more about you in the book. Can you just stand on your soapbox for a minute and give a little shout out to where they can continue this conversation with you? And
absolutely. Yeah. Come find me on Instagram. I'm talking a lot about this and various other things about adolescent and young adult mental health at Dr. Katie Hurley, LCSW. So please follow me there and join the conversation there. I have a great group there. And then, the book is available everywhere books are sold. It's called Breaking the Boy Code. And you can find my website, practicalkatie.com.
Great. And we'll repeat all of those, obviously, in the show notes and make them all linkable and everything. But thank you very, very much for this important contribution. It was really great to speak with you again.
It's been amazing. Thank you so much.
As you know, it takes a village to make a podcast, so thanks to my team, including Max Cotter, my editor and technician, as well as the crew at H2O Digital. This podcast was recorded in Toronto, Canada. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit.